Well, welcome all to the global webinar session of the Business History Collective. My name is Manuel Bautista-González. It is glad to see some familiar faces in attendance. Today, we have the pleasure of having with us Juan José Rivas Moreno from the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he is a PhD candidate. Juan José will present a paper titled, "How was the Manila Trade Financed? An Alternative Institutional Approach to Long-Distance Trade Finance, 1668-1828. And just to remind you, this event is being recorded. If you would like your contribution edited out of the video, please contact the chairs of the webinar at bizhiscollective@gmail.com. The mechanics of the session will be as follow. Juan José will have between 20 to 25 minutes for presenting his paper. And then we expect Fernando Arteaga from the University of Pennsylvania to provide some comments. Fernando is currently in a faculty meeting, so he will join us later. And if he hasn't joined by the time Juan José ends, I will start collecting questions from the audience. So without further ado, I will grant the chair to Juan José. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel, for the kind introduction, and thank you everybody for having me here today. So let me just share my screen. There we go. Desde el principio, yes, from the beginning. Come on, work. Okay. What I'm presenting today is a part of my thesis, and it revolves around the financing of the Manila trade during the early modern period. And I specifically wanted to ask this question also from the point of view a bit of like trying to wonder, looking at the East India companies, which are the big players that everybody knows a lot very well during this period, why did the Manila trade follow a different model? Why was it financing so differently? Why did it not incorporate this kind of questions? So what I'm going to do today is pretty straightforward. I will talk a little bit about the details of the Manila trade, so its main characteristics, and then I'll go into the research questions. The arguments that I put forward, and I will talk about the literature that I address, some of the sources that I used, and then we'll get into the meat of it, so the actual financing of the Manila trade. Now, the Manila trade overall was a trade that lasted for over 250 years and was the only early modern trade to consistently cross the Pacific throughout this period. It was based on the exchange of Asian commodities and manufactures for Spanish-American silver pesos, and it was a sizable trade with an estimated volume of 2 to 4 million pesos being shipped between Acapulco and Manila on the annual galleons. The trade was characterized by the existence of a premium on the Spanish-American peso, which I will talk a bit more about it later, and by large price differentials. So the price differentials have been estimated at standing at something between 1,100% to 1,600%, with profit margins estimated at something between 300 to 600%. Another important aspect of this trade is that the Manila-Acapulco crossing, so that part of it is the exclusive privilege of the city of Manila, and it relied on the crossing of one annual galleon that is carefully timed to the operation of two fairs in the Asian and the American ends of the exchange, so the Manila and the Acapulco fairs, and these galleons are some of the biggest ships of the line of their time. So we can see that in its composition, the trade was somewhat similar to that of the East India companies. We can also see from its structure that it was seemingly vulnerable to holdups and to shocks. In this context, several authors like Stensgaard or Williamson would predict that vertical integration in the form of a corporation would make sense. But interestingly, the Manila trade never incorporated. But what is even more surprising is that not only did it not incorporate, but in its disintegrated form, it managed to fend off the encroachment attempts of interlopers like the English and Dutch East India companies, and that later the competition of the Real Compañía de Filipinas, which is a joint stock company in which the King of Spain himself is involved in its chartering. So the Manila trade remained as the only trade to consistently monopolize the Pacific crossing for 250 years. They were present there for all that period. So given these characteristics, three big questions emerge. The first one is, why did the Manila trade never integrate? Why did they never think about that? The second is, how did they manage to defeat all other interlopers? How did they manage to protect that controlling position? And the third is, why did they rely on one single galleon? So why did they limit themselves to that? However, to answer all of these questions, we first have to understand how this trade is financed, which is what all boils down to. So in the presentation today, I want to explain how the Manila trade was financed, but this is not enough in and by itself. I also want to try and explain why the trade was financed in such a specific way and not in another. So for example, as a joint stock company. So the argument that I suggest why the trade is financed this way is a two-pronged argument. I first argue that Manila basically had no interest in vertically integrating. Manila, at the end of the day, is only an intermediary that can easily be bypassed. Rather, through the organization of its capital markets, Manila, as we will see, became a stakeholder in the trade, relying on the price differentials that exist between Spanish America and Asia. Manila therefore had no motivation to integrate, which resulted in a coordination failure as defined by Epstein, so a situation in which So yeah, well, we're saying something. Yes, a situation in which two markets do not integrate because there is no enforcement capable of getting the parties involved to keep their ex-ante guarantees. So basically, however, we all know that coordination failures are expensive because they lead to higher integration, higher transaction costs, since the economies of scale that result from market integration are forgone. However, this has been said, the Manileños are capable of maintaining their position in the Pacific Exchange. So they must have devised an operative model that made Manila competitive, or at least competitive enough to the compared to the existing alternatives at the time. So what I suggest mitigated this coordination failure of the Pacific Exchange is a process that I have termed horizontal specialization, but just to help me put it in contrast with vertical integration, which I would say is a process in which each link of the broader Pacific Exchange is unilaterally lowering transaction costs by specializing in a specific aspect of the trade. And in this context, we'll see that Manila is specialized as a provider of finance and as a risk manager. And in doing so, it lowered the costs of acquiring financial information and of enforcing contracts, and internalized and distributed all the risks of the Pacific Exchange, leading to lower overall financial costs. So basically, Manila is making itself indispensable by providing a service. So as you can see, the first part of the argument regards the motivation. So why did they do what they did? And the second regards the operation. So how are they doing? How did they manage to do it? Now, regarding the literature, I've put here some of the names that I use or address in one way or another. But what I really want to talk about is that the fact that while there is a wealth of literature on the joint stock company and its impact on long distance trade during the early modern period, there is comparatively little on how the Manila trade was specifically financed and operated. And furthermore, what exists has usually been written from the point of view of either America or Asia, without much emphasis on the perspective from Manila itself. So as a result, often we lack sources that are produced by the trade and for the use of the trade, such as the financial instruments that are used to finance this trade, or powers of attorney and this kind of thing. So sources that can help us put Manila at the center of the analysis. Now, I wanted to address this in my thesis, and in this presentation, I'll be using some corpus of sources that are of interest. Particularly important are the C-loan contracts that were used to finance the trade, as well as some account books, year-on-year account books of some legacy funds from Manila, but I'll also be using a host of other documents here and there. So with all of this, let's tackle the big issue, which is how is this trade financed? Okay. So first of all, the Manila trade is composed of two legs that converge in Manila. You have the Asian leg, which is represented by merchants that are from all over Asia that come to Manila and sail to Manila to sell their goods and manufacturers in the Manila Fair, and which are the black lines here. And then there's the American leg, which is the red line, which is the exclusive privilege of the citizens of Manila, and which was represented by the sailing of the one annual galleon from Manila to Acapulco and back. Three characteristics of the trade are important for us now. The first is that the only ones that are actually intermediating between Asian and New Spanish merchants at both ends of the exchange are the galleon freighters. which is a group of between 40 to 50 citizens in Manila that fight in the galleon year on year. The second is that the fares are carefully circumscribed within the meteorological time frame imposed by the typhoon season in Manila. So the ships must depart Manila and Acapulco before a specific date to avoid dangerous crossings, leading to serious time constraints on the Manila and Acapulco fares. And the third is that at some point during the early modern era, a global peso standard emerges. Basically because the peso is such an abundant, reliable, and uniform coin, in short, a very high quality coin, it starts being demanded as coin rather than bullion. And especially in areas in Asia and provinces in China, the peso trades at a value that is above its inherent metallic silver content. This means two things. The first one is that it is profitable to export pesos since it enjoys a higher purchasing power abroad than at home. And the second is that it makes this peso an extremely specific good that lacks any substitutes, because it is the coin that they're demanding. Now, regarding the premium of the peso, this was the result of the high demand that there was for a silver-based coin in Asia. It is impossible to date accurately the factors that produced this demand, but China is lacking of a unitary silver coin, so relying instead on tiles or silver ingots of different standards. The drying up of Japanese and Persian silver mines during the 17th century, and the fact that Spanish America was the largest producer of silver, which is coined before being exported, and also which is a very reliable coin, would have played a part in this outcome. There is plenty of evidence of the pricing of the peso above its inherent silver content. So the insistence of the English East India Company's Canton Committee that only pesos be shipped to Canton because every other single coin will be melted is a testimony of this. Holden Ferber reports different price for the peso in different parts of the world for the year of 1789, in which the peso sterling exchange rate favored the peso up to 60% above its inherent silver content in places like Basora. And a good proxy is also the exchange rates quoted on the bills of exchange that the Canton Committee is issuing payable by the Courts of Director in London. The very fact that payment in Canton is specified in pesos is already quite telling, but exchange rates could go over 30% in periods. And well, given the financial needs of the Canton Committee, it is difficult to see that there wouldn't be a peso premium operating here to sustain such a negative exchange rate for such a long period of time. But this, the evidence doesn't just concern the English, but virtually everybody is demanding pesos. And well, the Chinese even have manuals which teach you how to discern the markings in the coins and the mint marks. And they know very well how to discriminate by coin. So now, of course, the Manila trade needed financing. And in this aspect, the key were the obras pías. So obras pías are legacy funds that are often open as a testamentary will, but the owner didn't need to be dead, in which the city of Manila basically left the principle of money to a confraternity, a brotherhood or a tertiary order, to be invested in the trade by originating sea loans. The proceeds of the funds would then go to finance the charitable destinations specified by the founder of the fund and for the emolument of their souls. It's important to notice that this put them under the jurisdiction of canon law, but also the fund belongs to the soul, which is immortal. Legacy funds are common throughout the Catholic world, but only in Manila do we have cases of legacy funds that invested directly in long-distance trade by originating sea loans and on such a scale. So the first of these kinds of funds emerged in Manila in 1668, and they spread very quickly. The largest manager was the Brotherhood of the Misericordia, which in 1784 managed 53 funds. But I have collected individual level data of 255 funds operating in Manila during the long 18th century. And I know for a fact that there are a lot more than that, possibly over 300. Now, the proceeds of the funds go to finance a large welfare state in Manila. So the funds paid for the burial of brothers, they paid for the salaries of doctors, of priests, of professors. They endowed the universities of Manila, they paid for hospitals, the dowry fund, basically everything you can imagine. So in one way or another, Manila came to rely heavily on the proceeds from these funds. It is also important to notice that the charitable destinations of the legacy funds were spelled out in the testaments that opened the fund. And testaments being notarized, they were publicly accessible to those in Manila through the archive of the notary. This allowed different institutions and confraternities to monitor each other, and there is evidence that they did this. The management of the obras pías was professionalized in the form of mesas, which literally means boards, which were elected annually from the broader membership of the confraternities. It is important to notice that there was a significant overlap between the managers of mesas, the galleon fighters, and the founders of obras pías, in the sense that they were often the same people or belonged to a network of clients, associates, relatives, etc. What is also important to mention, however, is that the membership of these confraternities and tertiary orders seem to have encompassed a great proportion of the population of Manila, and for the little we know, they seem to have not discerned by race. For the little I know, sorry. Another important element of the capital, oops, sorry, I jumped the gun. How do I go back? Here. Another important element of the capital markets in Manila were the instruments that were used to finance the trade. Sea loans, or correspondencias, as they were locally known in Manila, were a hybrid instrument that combined elements of credit and insurance. So in essence, they were a loan of money that was tied to the voyage of a specific ship and were only repayable upon the successful return of the ship. This meant that ultimately the risk of loss at sea was transferred to the well-capitalized obras pías, whose investments were also diversified between the Asian and the American legs. This also allowed the obras pías to charge higher interest rates on the sea loans, which in the period of between 1733 and 1800 stood at between 20 to 50% for Acapulco, with a mode of 30%. Also important to notice is that sea loans are notarized and accessible to the public through the archive of the notary. So everybody within Manila could check on the sea loans that have been issued. The structure of the Manila credit market meant that the city as a whole became a stakeholder in the trade, as it relied on the proceeds of the legacy funds. As a result, the following equation emerged at some point. The higher the profit margins of the trade, the higher the interest rates that can be charged in the sea loans, therefore the higher the proceeds of the funds and the higher the welfare that accrued to the city. So Manila had no intention of integrating the trade. They want to maintain that wedge in prices. This also means that interest rates are fundamental, and the plotted interest rates throw a very interesting picture. So as mentioned previously, interest rates to Acapulco varied from 20 to 50% throughout the 18th century, with 30% as the mode. And although this is high in absolute terms, the interest rates of the Pacific Exchange were actually surprisingly low, given the instruments that were used and the fact that the commerce relied on the crossing of the largest body of water without any watering stops twice to go and to come back. As an example, sea loans issued in Madras for Manila in the 1740s could easily charge 40% interest, representing less than a third of the trip that the Manila correspondencias to Acapulco financed. Similarly, covering shorter distance sea loans issued in Cadiz in the 18th century for Spanish America could reach even 50 to 75% interest rates. So in this context, again, 30% interest rates for the crossing of the Pacific twice is actually quite low. Now, the structure of the capital markets in Manila and the way they made the city stakeholder of the Pacific Exchange impacted the operation of the trade. In this regard, it is important to bear in mind 4 fundamental points that have been brought up during the presentation so far. The first is that the Manileños must incur heavy outlays before they can even open the negotiations at Acapulco, as they must buy the Asian goods and freight the galleon. The second is that the high demand for pesos and its lack of substitutes skewed the bargaining power in favor of New Spanish wholesale retailers in Acapulco. This is also the result of New Spain being supplied with manufacturers from Europe via Spain and Veracruz, goods that could ultimately be competitive with those imported from Asia via Manila. Only the peso really has no substitutes in this trade, and again, that is because it is the coin that is being demanded. All of this means that new Spanish retailers can choose to behave opportunistically and create holdups. And in fact, we know that this is the main strategy, main negotiating strategy in the Acapulco fair. And finally, we must remember that for this negotiation to be worthwhile for the Manileños, they must obtain excess profits that can repay the interest rates of the sea loans and finance the proceeds of the legacy funds. So bearing all of these factors in mind, a game theory model of the one galleon business strategy can be made to illustrate the organizational choice faced by the Manileños. So this is basically for me to help me illustrate the point. I mean, such a game is framed as a 2-player, with player 1 being Manila and player 2 being Mexico, multiple transaction game in which information is considered public, and the choice being between a free model trade, a free trade model in which everybody can ship whatever they want whenever they want, or establishing cartels restrictions. And payoffs would be skewed in favor of New Spain in order to represent the specificity of the peso. But in such a game, like really what matters here is to help me illustrate the point that Manila does not have a dominant strategy, but Mexico does. And that is to always cartelize. Because in reality, in the Acapulco Fair, nothing prevented Mexican retailers from withholding from the Acapulco Fair until the Manileños had to depart and lower the prices to the point where they only cover the costs. However, Manileños needed to maintain a certain profit margin. Freighting one single galleon, while contrary to the orders of the kings who specified two, enabled the Manileños to both present a unified negotiating front and monitor each other, preventing competition between themselves that can only lead to falling prices if faced by a buyer's cartel. The one single galleon could have also been a good way of restricting supply, because while the specificity of the peso and the huge demand that exists for it basically guarantees that there will be no price convergence, it is relatively dangerous to glut Spanish-American markets with commodities. So this model presented obviously several problems, relied as it did on a system of mirror cartels in Acapulco in order to protect Manila's consuetudinary privilege and the need of Manileños to prevent all-out integration. However, it also had some strengths that allowed it to survive the onslaught of the Dutch and English East India companies. So the fragmentation of the Pacific Exchange led to an alternative path of horizontal specialization, which I say was a process through which each link of the Pacific Exchange unilaterally lowered transaction costs by specializing in a specific aspect of the trade. In the case of Manila, this meant specializing as the financier of the trade, and therefore in internalizing and distributing the risks of the exchange. And this is specialization, we can see it in two different ways. The first is through the lower interest rates, which represent the lower costs of acquiring information about the credibility of the participants in the market, which in Manila is obviously all part of the dense network that is the city, and the lower costs of enforcing contracts, because something that we see in the account books of the legacy funds is that if someone doesn't repay their loans, they're essentially excluded. And then that network being so dense, if someone is excluded from the operations of a mesa, it is realistic to see that everybody knows about it. So efficient was this, the sea loans in Manila did not require collateral, contrary to the custom in most parts of the world. Finally, thanks to the public access archive of the notary, legacy fund managers, merchants, and the public at large could access all kinds of information on the issuance of loans and of the opening of funds. Information was therefore easily accessible within Manila, and enforcement was cheap through exclusion from the credit originated by the obras vías. So the result was lower interest rates on sea loans than any of their competitors, given the size of the Pacific crossing, which would also mean that Manileños could potentially negotiate for cheaper final prices in Acapulco. And actually, the lowest interest rate that we have recorded on a sea loan issued in Manila for Acapulco is 11% in 1811. So that's 11% for crossing the Pacific twice. And secondly, the annual rate of return on invested capital of the legacy funds are also proof of how the trade was operated. So annual returns of funds averaged something like 5 to 7% during the 18th century, which in the context of a trade whose profits are estimated at something between 300 to 600% is very low. This is because
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Oh, no. Okay, thanks. This is because the funds absorb all of the shocks while paying out the proceeds in the form of welfare that directly linked the fortunes of Manila as a city to the trade. So the legacy funds were not the main winners of this trade, but that is because they were not designed to be. They were designed to be resilient, to internalize the risk and provide financing so that the citizens of Manila could keep accessing the Acapulco negotiation year on year and on leverage. So essentially, Manila is basically working as a huge bank. So the conclusions are as follows. The capital markets of Manila geared the city into becoming a stakeholder, creating a direct link between the welfare accrued to the city and the profit margins through the interest charged by the obras vías. There was therefore no motivation to integrate the trade. And second, the specificity of the pesos skewed the bargaining power in Acapulco in favor of the new Spanish wholesale retailers. So the one galleon may have been the best strategy to adopt to guarantee a certain level of profit margin. And third, Manila's specialization as a financial hub in which information flowed internally rather than vertically lowered the costs of financing and operating the trade while absorbing the risk, making the model at least more competitive than that of the existing alternatives of the time. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Juan Jose. So at this time, I'm going to let Fernando Arteaga comment or discuss your presentation. Fernando is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Economics Department. He received his PhD in economics from George Mason University, and I am very glad to have been lecturer of his in his undergrad in the National Autónoma de Mexico University. And his research interests are at the intersection of economic history, new institutional economics, and development economics. So without further ado, I will let Fernando discuss your presentation. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So first of all, it's quite interesting. I really like the idea of studying the Manila trade with the perspective of localizing the interests of the Manileños instead of just looking into the perspective of the Americans or the Europeans or the rest of the Asians. I think that is quite innovative. I think I have some comments and questions that I realize that this is a project that you still are working. I think COVID made you may have slowed the project, but I don't know. But for example, I think you may gain a lot by looking into comparative cases, not really by looking specifically within the text, but by giving you idea, because I think all this scenario looks pretty much the same as basically trade in Europe in medieval times. Like, why did trade fairs exist in the very first place? Why did the Spaniards actually engage in trade in this way, through trade fairs instead of mercantilistic joint stock companies, which is the way in which you motivate your presentation at the beginning. And the reasoning is, of course, because of high transaction cost and because rent seeking and because the nature of the way in which the societies at that time were created. So what we have is a society in medieval times that is quite uncertain. The state does not have a lot of state capacity. So the only thing that it needs to actually basically have incentives to get tax revenue is through localizing the trade in the specific areas. And the way in which people have to actually create markups is to create guilds, and these guilds dominate the interactions and the access to trades. And so this also is indebted to the problems of geographical constraints. So in ancient times, traveling and transporting goods was difficult. So the easiest way to protect a caravan was basically making one large caravan that is quite protected, instead of what we have today, free market, in which basically goods move around. So I think there's a huge literature on that, not specific on Manila, of course, not even in the Atlantic, but respect to the champagne fairs in the 13th century in Europe. And what you see again is a quite similar explanation, I think, to what you find about why Manila existed. It's the same explanation of why Champagne existed, which is basically as a financial hub, in which there were the principal role that the French people in Champagne, in the centrality of France, the function that they provide is basically as a clearinghouse of goods that needed to be transported. Why did the Champagne fairs cease to exist? Is because the other merchants in the rest of Europe realized that they could also create that, follow that same function by making basically banks. And that's how you have the first arisal of banks or banking houses in northern Italy and so on. So I think if maybe this is a little bit going astray because it's not the case you're studying, but I always like to do comparative cases, because this institution again is nothing new. It's just a path independent process that is inherited from the past. Now, you really look into financial aspects, so rather than on the political economy of how Manila was governed. But I would very much like also to see exactly what is the political and hierarchical coercive actors here. How is the relationship between the polity of Manila and New Spain? So the audiencia, or basically even though the boletas or the ones that actually had an interest in the trade were Manileños itself, well, who could actually go to Manila, but basically they had to go through Mexico, and basically the Viceroy of New Spain appointed the governor of Manila. So what you could say is that even though Manila and New Spain are different, it's not to me clear in where the difference lies. You could say that basically New Spain dominates Manila, and basically that they are the same people. What you see is that the Mexico City Merchant Guild basically has its own agents operating within Manila. And even though the rights are reserved to Manileños, the Manileños are your family members of the Mexicans in the very first place, which is basically the thesis from Bonialiana and all this literature in America. So it's not to me quite clear how could you differentiate between the interests of Manileños themselves as being different compared to those of Mexico. And also the data that you use is mainly from the 17th century, but from the 18th century. And basically the obras pias or the legacy funds that you talk about is something that starts in the middle 17th century. And that's how you explain basically the fact that it's only one ship. But what you see then is that the restrictions on the galleons started actually in the 16th century. The first restriction was in 1593 by King Philip, in which basically he says that only 2 ships were allowed to travel between Mexico and the Philippines. And the historical conclusion about why that is the case is because political economy reasons and problems between the elites in Spain and Mexico, in which basically the Spaniards realized that the Mexicans had access to Chinese goods. So basically in order, the Europeans had trouble selling their own European goods in Mexico. And so, as you said, they competed for basically who get the silver pesos. So the Spaniards said, well, at some point, actually, there's evidence that the Spaniards actually wanted to abandon the Philippines because it was affecting the merchants in Europe. So that's how can we get the idea that Manila was kind of, rather than a Spain's colony, it was mostly a Mexican colony. And that touches upon the same point that I talked before, which is how much different, politically speaking, was Manila with respect to America. And the other thing, and this is also, again, because the changes start happening not in the 17th century, not in the 18th century, but in the 16th century. And the traditional explanation is just political economy, not because of reasons of finance. And so these are my 2 main comments, or my 2 main questions that I had. I could elaborate on some more, but really, general, I think it's quite interesting. I have novel data about the role of the interest rates and the markups, and why specifically the Manileños themselves, not only the Mexicans, but the Manileños had an interest in maintaining the status quo. But also what we don't see is not just about the beginning, like the beginning does not match your explanation, but just about the end. How would you say that the Royal Company of the Philippines actually plays the role? You talk a little bit about them, but you don't explain exactly how does this company actually compete with basically the trade fair that had occurred for centuries. Also, by the time of Mexican independence, which basically in 1815 was the last time a galleon sailed, by that time, actually, in the 18th century, the galleon actually already had ceased to be as relevant as it was earlier on. So what you see is really a decline in the trade between Mexico and Manila. Of course, there is no data about the amount of goods that are being transported, but there is data about the ships that have been sailed from Mexico and Manila, and from Manila to Mexico, and you have anecdotal evidence, and we know that by the late 18th century, the trade was not as relevant as it was earlier on. And you could say that there's a correlation with basically the creation of the Royal Company of the Philippines, but of course there is no causality there. What I'm saying is that really the Royal Company of Philippines could be created in the very first place, mostly because the rent-seeking interest in the Manila trade were not already that powerful as they were in the 17th century. So I guess with that, I will let you speak, and I will open. And I really like the project in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. So for the sake of efficiency, I will let Juan Jose respond to Fernando's comments, and then I'll open the floor to questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comments, Fernando. They're really good. They're very good and thought-provoking. I'm going to start a bit backwards and try to answer in whatever way I can. So regarding the Real Compañía de Filipinas and how it actually competes, you're right. I did not say much about them, but there was a limit of time, so it's a good topic in itself. The real issue that the Real Compañía de Filipinas starts in 1785 is that while it is not allowed to ship directly to Acapulco, because precisely the interests of the Manileños are still strong enough that way, they are allowed to supply Asian goods to Spanish America in other ways. So there are times when they send supplies and a lot of goods to other places, like in Guatemala. They are allowed to go to Chile, they are allowed to go to Peru, and in doing so they glut markets there, because of course Latin America, Spanish America, is also connected with a lot of intra-regional trade routes. But the thing is that the Manila trade managed to defend it, and by the end of already by the Napoleonic period, the Real Compañía de Filipinas is basically not operating on a large scale anymore. Now, you're right that the whole trade finishes by the beginning of the 19th century. The trade does suffer a lot from the Napoleonic Wars because, well, Britain has a navy, and for parts of it, Spain is at war with Britain. But much more important than that. So the Manila trade, the privilege of the galleon expires in 1815. There's still the San Blas galleons that are sailing from Manila to San Blas in Mexico up to 1821, which is Mexican independence. But in reality, I think that this trade basically revolved around the peso. The purpose was to get the peso out of New Spain, which was a very efficient producer of a very good coin. But the peso basically implodes as the empire implodes. So once one part of the motivation for this trade, or the demotivation for this trade, is gone, then the whole trade is gone. But for a good 30 to something years, the Real Compañía de Filipinas and the Manileños were capable of existing together. And regarding the fact that the restrictions start in the 16th century, you're right. So the restrictions start in 1593, and it was Philip II, we finished 1591. It is the first reglamento that is issued. So this reglamento is basically the rules of the game that are imposed. However, some of the rules are followed, some of the rules are not. And what is interesting for me is that the King of Spain doesn't really enforce much in the terms of restrictions, even if it is surprisingly, because it is the Manileños that want to have one single ship. So the king allows two, the Manileños want one. They even write a letter during the beginning of the big legal battles that existed at the beginning of the 18th century, in which they petition the king to have one. So what is the purpose for them to restrict themselves? So in that aspect, the king is less important than it has usually been seen or depicted. He's still very important, because the king at the end of the day is the person that grants the reglamento. He's the person that whenever there's litigation between Manila and Seville, which is litigation that is really affecting Manila and France, because it's not the Spanish, well, and Seville too as an intermediary in the carrera, but the goods that are competing, I mean, Spanish textiles are not really that important in the Atlantic run either. It's mostly like, and I believe it isn't just a book that says that the whole litigation started because the French consul complained. But the king is the judge and the arbiter, and he eventually sides with the Manileños. But my point is that the Manileños have an interest in having that reglamento, because through that reglamento is also the guarantee of their privilege. It is also the guarantee that they can keep their control, and they will follow the book, and there will be a negotiation, and of course there will be restrictions on both sides. But the reglamento is, for the Manileños, the one thing that they can always bring up. And in fact, in the proceedings of the freighting of the galleons and of their disembarkment in Acapulco and stuff, they mention it and they brought it up. And there's sometimes that there's litigation and there's a judge that is especially commissioned to oversee these things. And the Manileños walk up the freighters with the reglamento, being like, these are our, these are the rules. It's also interesting, and here we get into the issue of like how to distinguish between Mexicans and Manileños. We all know that the king issues a lot of times bans on the money of the Mexicans moving to Manila, but what is not really well advertised often is the fact that a lot of the times is the Manileños petitioning for this. And so, yes, it's true. Justa and Bonalian open a great path when they reviewed this relationship. And it's true that in my presentation, I focused a lot more on competition between Mexico and Manila rather than cooperation, and cooperation was definitely a very big part of it. But the reason why I focus on this is because it's always like competition has always been brushed aside. One thing that is important is that it's true that the Manileños come through New Spain, but very often the Manileños and the New Spanish, who are part of a big family, they all come from Spain. So the Bermúdez are from Galicia, the Memije come from Galicia. Blas de Castrillón y Casarriego, who is for a time the principal of the Spanish overseer of the Parian, and issues a lot of sea loans. When he dies, he lends his money to fund a legacy fund in his hometown in Asturias. And while there is a relationship between the Manileños and the New Spanish, and it's a very important one, it's not one of agents. The main reason for this is that if the Manileños were actually agents of the Mexicans, then why would and as Juste suggests, the Mexicans are actually financing the Manileños, then why would the Mexicans refuse to negotiate in Acapulco? And we have evidence throughout the 18th century, but from before, that the Acapulco fair is basically a game of chicken, of waiting there. So why would they do that? Another question too would be like, well, if the Mexicans are already financing the Manileños and the Manileños are just their agents, then why, to start with, why would they stay in Manila? I mean, in 1619, I believe it is, the Emperor of China grants the Spanish Macau. Manila is literally a stop on the place. Why wouldn't they just go directly to China? Things like this. I conceive of this relationship, which is an important one, and I'm glad you pointed out, more of a relationship of trust, sort of like suppliers. Even in today's retail chains, you have supply chains, and you buy from your trusted supplier, but it doesn't mean that he's your agent or anything. This is still a transaction, and they're both negotiating with tooth and nails. That's for sure. I mean, the instructions of the Manileños to the freighters they're quite explicit about this. And regarding the political economy, how am I doing with time? Ooh. Yes.
1 more minute.
1 minute. Well, we can discuss this more in an email because it's really interesting, and I love talking about people that know about the Manila trade, and I don't meet that many. So, but yes, the Philippines and New Spain are certainly different, at least in the thing that matters. So the governor is appointed by the king, but at least when it comes to the law, I'm sorry, my English is bad. Something that is fundamental about the Philippines is that they have their own audiencia. And that is crucial, because above the audiencia then comes directly the Council of the Indies. It's true that the Viceroy does perform a task in here. It's true that the governor is technically under the stewardship of the viceroy, but the governor is appointed by the king, and the audiencia can directly go to the Council of the Indies. But about this, and I think that I'm missing some other stuff that you also mentioned, we can even chat at some point if it's good. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Juan Jose. So I have two people in the queue. I'm going to read their questions since they wrote them in the chat. Bernardo Batis asks if there are any links between obras pías and savings banks in the Philippines. And then Carlos Gabriel Guimaraes, I think, asks or says, merchants at the consulate in Mexico City control the Philippine galleon. Was the institutional organization of the galleon a limit for its administration or no? Was there any contact between the galleon and the boats of the Portuguese Indian carrier which reached Macau? Thank you.
Yes, I muted myself again. So yeah, thank you, Bernardo. So links between the obras pías and the saving banks in the Philippines. There is a very important link. I don't know too much. I think that I lost. I tend to lose track of the obras. I know that the obras pías are still working by the 1970s. So these obras pías last forever. I don't know exactly what form they take after. The account books that I have finished in 1847, and at that point they're still investing exactly as they did. It's only that the galleon has stopped. So they invest on different things, but they still issue loans, etc. There is a really important link between the banking system in the Philippines during the 19th century, and this is something more that I have read than something that I know about, and is that with the proceeds, with the interest from obras pías, they found, they capitalized the Banco Hispano-Filipino, which is basically the Philippines branch of the National Bank of Spain, of the central bank. Now, I'm not exactly sure. At some point in 1838, the Misericordia asks to change his business model into a premium insurance company. So obviously, with the end of the peso trade, everything changes radically. But I don't know exactly if there is a relationship specifically between the obras pías and the saving banks, especially because from what I know, so I have an account book, for example, from 1914, in which the obras pías of the tertiary order of St. Francis are still operating. They belong to confraternities and brotherhoods, really. So I don't know. I'm sorry that I can't be of much help with that. And the other question,
the question was there any contact between the galleon and the boats of the Portuguese Indian carrier? And was the institutional organization of the galleon a limit for its administration or no?
Right. So regarding the contact with the Portuguese, now if you refer to the Great Amazon, that one ship that is fundamental and appears everywhere in the literature, I don't know that it's specifically that ship specifically calls in Manila, but there is definitely a big link between Manila and Portuguese Macau. So in the 18th century, this link is more tenuous, but before that, Portugal has its prints all over Manila. Of course, there's a lot of changes happening in time, and the 17th century, the early 17th century is very different from the 18th century, or even from the late 17th century. But you only have to see the role of the citizens of Manila, and you see Salazar, you see Noronha's, you see, like, the Misericordia itself is a Portuguese institution that is brought into Manila. In fact, the Misericordia of Manila is founded with a copy-paste of the charter of the Misericordia of Lisbon. So there is a massive contact. By the 18th century, it's less dense. There is only one ship. Now, regarding any influence in the way of financing, I jumped. The institutional organization of the galleon, a limit for its administration. I'm not exactly sure what you mean with this. The institutional organization of the
if Carlos Gabriel can elaborate on that question, that I can read it out loud. So next in the queue is Cristina Juan. Cristina asks or says, there seem to be a lot of changes in trade policies after the 1762 British occupation of Manila. Did you see any influence in the way financing was done because of English mercantilism? I also see London in the slides you presented. What did that signify?
Right, so I think that the mention to, which was my mention to London? Well, to start with, when it comes to the actual modus operandi of financing, there really isn't a big change after the 1762 British occupation of Manila. So it was momentous for sure, because one of the things that the English did was to put a ransom on Manila, and a huge part of that ransom came from the obras-pías. So they were very damaged by that. But in terms of the way that it is structured, so in the sense of like they still use the sea loans, they still invested in, they diversified the investments between the Asian and the American legs. The interest rates also didn't change much. But sorry. There were a lot of other changes revolving around this, but and the way of financing the trade, so it's reliance on obras-pías that originate sea loans and the use of those sea loans, that doesn't change. Before, in the 18th century, in the long 18th century, pre-1762, post-1762, there's no difference. Where did I mention London? I hope that answers that question. And I don't know. Yeah.
Next in the queue is Rainier Vergara. I'm going to read his or her question. What do you think is the economic impact of the galleon trade to New Spain, Mexico, and the Philippines after gaining their respective independence from Spain?
So what do I think is the impact of the galleon trade to New Spain and the Philippines after gaining their respective independence from Spain? So if you mean how the galleon, what was the impact of independence on New Spain and on the galleon? Well, basically, one part of the changes from 1762 that follows up is that the king, one of the main purposes of the king really in having the Philippines is that he can spend 200,000 pesos, and he explicitly says this very, very often. He can spend 200,000 pesos plus whatever the Manileños are getting out of Mexico to fortify the Philippines, so that he doesn't have to spend 200 million pesos in fortifying the Pacific. Something that is said constantly in all the literature. I haven't seen a topic that is more constantly mentioned when it comes to Manila. From Juan Grau Monfalcón in the 1630s to the late 18th century is the fact that Manila and the Philippines have a massive geopolitical importance for the Spanish Empire, because as long as the Dutch and the English are crushing their heads against Manila, the king can forego the small expenditure of keeping Manila supplied rather than having to defend the huge coastline that is the Pacific. And the king himself says this, recognizes it quite a few times. And there's no coincidence that the first governors a lot of the first governors of the Philippines are actually specifically soldiers that are trained in the Dutch wars. So when 1762 happens, a big change may not happen in the financing of the trade, but a massive change happens in the approach of the government to what is happening in the Philippines. And one of the things that they realize is that the British are on fire, and there's no way to stop them, and they have to change the whole model. So from the late 18th century, the Spanish government is putting efforts into getting Manila away from its dependency on the galleon. It doesn't really work until the peso stops. That's the important thing. But the structure starts being laid down little by little. The impact for Mexico of the end of the galleon line, I'm not entirely sure. it definitely a bigger impact for the world economy at large is the end of the peso. Once the peso is over, there is simply the whole basis from which the trade had been conducted for 250 years are done. And what we can see is that actually Manila and the Philippines at large, which were suffering before from a lot of cost opportunity cost problems, because it's cheaper to import things from another place. We see that the government starts investing in the estanco de tabaco. We see that there is a lot more emphasis on growing the local economy and things like this. So I hope that this is what you meant, but yeah, I hope that this is an answer of some sort, basically.
So I'm going to make a comment. I'm not so sure it's a question. I have looked at the provisional mint of Guadalajara, the closest city to the port of San Blas, which you mentioned, for the period of the Mexican Wars of Independence, roughly 1810 to 1821. There I saw that Manila merchants were the first and most important group of traders bringing silver bars for coinage. So in a sense, they're facing a dynamic inconsistency problem, right? Because what is optimum for all periods, that is to say, to preserve their place in the Spanish empire political economy by maintaining the Spanish-American peso standard at the imperial level, is not so optimum for that period, where their main interest is to coin those silver bars and take the coins, even if they're not coined at the quality that the Mexico City Mint produces, back to the Philippines in an era characterized by political and monetary instability. So in a sense, it is quite interesting to see that these actors in the periphery of the Spanish Empire are actually acting, against the interest of the empire in an era where everything is up for grabs and being defined. And that was something that I wanted to mention. I was very happy when I saw that you extended your analysis throughout the whole of the period where Mexico is part of the empire. And I can share with you that working paper if you want.
Yes, please,
so
definitely.
I think I don't have any other questions. So we have 3 more minutes. And I don't know if Fernando or Juan José want to add anything to what has been discussed.
No, just thank you very much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to talk to people that are interested in the same issue. And yeah, it's an honor that I can present the work to you and share it. Always take a lot of pride in the work we do. So thank you.
Well, yeah, I have nothing to add. Maybe we can discuss this more in private, because we have a lot to talk, but maybe it's not an interest for the rest of people. But yeah, I really like the project, and thank you for inviting me to comment.
Well, I do want to thank Juan José for presenting, Fernando for discussing the presentation, and everyone for their attendance. And I do want to invite you all to the following webinar sessions, which are all in our website, bizhiscollective.wordpress.com. And I thank you all for being here. I'm going to stop recording now.